Good morning, everyone. Good evening to some of our colleagues who are not in the Eastern Caribbean time zone. Welcome to this webinar, which is aimed at bringing together the trade and climate change community. What I want to think of as the climate change and trade nexus. It's interesting that I've been asked to moderate this session because my name is Daniel Kane. I'm a project development specialist with the Caribbean Community Climate Change Center. But I've done some work in the area of trade as an economist. And so I'm excited to be a part of this coming together of the community. Today we have before us 4 distinct speakers who will, put to us some thought-provoking elements on both sides of trade and climate change. And then we'll explore how these two things come together. We have with us Ambassador Carlos Fuller, who is no stranger to those who are on the climate change side of things. He's a negotiator who has been in this space. He has worked with the Caribbean Community Climate Change Center, and now he is the Belize ambassador to the UN out in New York. We have Ambassador Colin Murdoch, who is a negotiator, an ambassador to the OECS, and is in negotiations at the WTO on behalf of the OECS. He's also an observer to the UN. We have Genevieve Reeves Remy, and we have Miss Rona Hayes. Genevieve has been an avid researcher in the space of trade, but also one of those persons who have recognized the importance of crossing the elements of climate change and trade together. And Rona has been in the space of climate change negotiation for quite some time, and she brings to this space. Let me just pause for a little bit before I hand over to the speaker to kind of set the context. At the macro level, when you talk to a trade economist, one of the first things that rolls off their tongue is the welfare effects of trade, the welfare gains from trade. For those who don't understand that, because I realize I'm talking to climate change and people as well who might not understand what that means. It means that through trade, we, the people, should benefit from lower prices or access to greater quantities or variety of goods. On the side of climate change as well, our negotiators will tell you that they are also trying to maximize welfare to the people. Now we have two sides of a coin, both parties trying to maximize welfare gains to the population of this planet. And so it is important that these two things come together for us to end up with an equilibrium that is optimal and maximizes actually welfare gains to the ordinary man in the street. With that said, let me hand over to Ambassador Carlos Fuller to give us some remarks. Ambassador.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kane, and it's a pleasure to join you today on this distinguished panel. I will be sharing my screen with you. There you go. Let me just share some context with you to begin the webinar. I am CARICOM negotiators met in Miami last week to develop its negotiating position going into COP28 later this year. And we were joined by the ministers on the last day of the meeting, where we got their endorsement of our negotiating positions. Today, I am actually in Panama, where Panama is hosting the Latin American and Caribbean Climate Week. This brings together the policymakers, the ministers, negotiators, but very importantly, the people working on the ground on climate change within the Caribbean, Central America, and South America. So it's an interesting session to be at. we have some 2,000 participants here today. CARICOM's involvement in the climate change process is really from the point of view of vulnerability. Like all small island developing states, the CARICOM member states are also extremely vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. That includes, of course, sea level rise, erosion as a result of sea level rise, saltwater intrusion into the coastal aquifers and also onto our agricultural lands. The warming atmosphere and the ocean are contributing to coral bleaching, acidification of the ocean and the Caribbean Sea, impacts on agriculture because of changing rainfall patterns and increasing temperatures. And of course, we have more extreme weather events, more intense events like hurricanes, intense rainfall, and the opposite, droughts. So CARICOM's priorities going into COP28 comes from two main areas. First of all, limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius and the importance of adaptation for all our member states. And so the four areas we'll be focusing on at COP28 are the global stocktake. This is a part of the Paris Agreement where every 5 years we are to take stock of the global process to meeting the objectives of the Paris Agreement. This 2-year process so far has shown us that the world is off track to meet the objectives of the Paris Agreement. The financial support to developing countries is not adequate, and the G20 countries who are responsible for over 80% of global emissions must enhance their mitigation and cut emissions by 50% in this decade to ensure that we get on the 1.5 degree track. Developed countries must live up to their financial obligations. That is a must for us as we go to COP28. We need to operationalize the loss and damage fund. And finally, CARICOM is fully behind the CDB's proposal to host the Santiago network on loss and damage. So the processes and the challenges we'll be going through at COP28 include the GST outcomes. We would like to see a decision coming out of the CMA process saying that indeed the Paris Agreement is not on track in its objectives. We want to see a political declaration where the politicians, the leaders themselves are saying this must change. And finally, we need a follow-up process after the COP is over. How are we going to follow up to ensure that we get on track to meet the objectives of the Paris Agreement? One of the problems we have right now is the Transitional Committee to agree on the loss and damage fund has failed so far to come up to an agreement. And I understand they're going to go into an emergency session next week to try to see if they can come up to an agreement to present to the COP to agree on the loss and damage fund. Africa and CARICOM are at an impasse right now on posting the Santiago network. The other group that is also vying for it is made up of UNOPS and the UNDRR. However, they were very sneaky in saying that they want to host the agreement in Nairobi. And hence, Africa, of course, then went along with the UNOPS, while CARICOM continues to support CDB on it. Our political leaders must meet and come to an agreement between the CARICOM leaders and the African presidents. And then finally, to address the issue of finance, we have far too many agenda items at this COP, over 20 agenda items dealing with finance. And obviously, all of them are saying developed countries are not leading up to their obligations. So where are these synergies on climate change and trade? First of all, on Article 6 of the Paris Agreement deals with markets. And this is an area I think CARICOM has to be very careful on. Under the CDM process, under the Kyoto Protocol, we've heard this cry that the Caribbean did not take advantage of it. Well, in fact, you need to understand the context. The countries that were able to use the CDM to develop their markets were Brazil, China, India, and South Africa. And the reason was that they had excess liquidity, excess foreign exchange to invest in projects in their own countries, develop the projects, and then sold the credits. The only country in CARICOM that had that was Jamaica, using funding that they got from Petrocarib. They were able to save that, invest a project in Jamaica, and then sold the credits. Obviously, CARICOM countries don't have that excess liquidity to develop projects and then sell the credits. And no developed country wants to invest in small markets and take all the risk. So this has not changed, and unless there's a way of changing it, CARICOM again will not be able to engage in the markets under the Article 6 mechanism of the Paris Agreement. The other area where markets are involved are in response measures. And an example where that occurred again in the last decade was in the United States when the corn growers realized that there was a market to transform their corn products into energy. That then created a negative impact in Mexico because they used to import the corn from the United States for tortillas, and that created a huge problems in Mexico because they were then not able to have that corn for food. So again, these response measures could affect developing countries who depend on products from developed countries who may have transitioned. And that then brings us over to the area of the just transition, where we are concerned that that the transition into renewable energy and to low carbon trajectories could leave us behind. And unless our markets are able to transition into this also, we again will be left out. And then also, when you look at all the adaptation and mitigation measures being put in place, for example, in agriculture to adapt into mitigation measures, again, unless we are able to make that transition and to ensure that our industries are ready to move into these new areas of low carbon development, again, we'll be left behind in these markets. As we know, Europe is now implementing the carbon border adjustment mechanism. And for us to know to export products into Europe, we will have to be able to track the carbon through the entire production process. That is, extracting the materials from the soil has to be done. We'll be tracking how much carbon is used there, how we produce, how we process our products, how we package our products, and how we ship our products. The entire carbon track will be passed through this process, and we have to show that indeed we are doing it in as low carbon use as possible. And an area where the Latin America really showed that the markets were important for them was the latest negotiations at the IMO on reducing emissions in shipping. And Latin America, that is the South American countries and the Central American countries, were very adamant that they would not support any carbon levy, as that would then affect their ability to ship their products to the markets in Europe. So again, an area that they are linking markets with emission reductions. So with that, I look forward to our discussions in the upcoming session. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Fuller, for that very insightful presentation on CARICOM's position, but also what is happening in the international scene and some of the things we need to keep our eyes on. With that said, I'll hand over to Ambassador Murdoch for his presentation or intervention. You're on mute, Ambassador.
Yes, sorry. Yes, thank you very much. And I also want to thank Ambassador Fuller for that very enlightening presentation, especially coming out as he was from actual meeting of CARICOM ministers responsible for the environment. So we have the very latest position of the CARICOM going into the COP. And I think what is happening in certainly in the area of the environment and also in the area of trade at the WTO, because the WTO also has a ministerial coming up in Abu Dhabi in February, MC 13, Ministerial Conference 13. And I think generally in trade agreements and certainly at the WTO, climate issues are beginning to rise on the international agenda. And people are beginning more and more to see the nexus between trade and climate. And they are looking for new ways to be able to adopt mitigation strategies that harness trade mechanisms. There are a number of other interesting developments as well. And I think generally the Caribbean, CARICOM, is coming to many of these issues out of a sense of frustration, where the Caribbean has been talking for quite a while about climate change, about climate justice. And they believe, many of them do, that they have not been listened to adequately. And hence we see certain initiatives taking place, such as the Commission on Small Island States, which has brought an action at the International Tribunal on the Law of the Sea, relating to asking the tribunal to issue an opinion on the responsibility for climate change and the implications flowing from that responsibility. We also see the action at the International Court of Justice, which has been joined by several CARICOM countries, also relating to climate change. So there has been some action coming out of frustration, I think, from Caribbean countries that see that the traction they thought they would get on some of the climate justice issues is just not there. And some of them feel there's no alternative but to go the legal route and approach international tribunals on these questions. But as far as the UN is concerned, I think one interesting initiative that seems to be making progress is the UN Plastics Pollution Treaty, which is making its way, and they should have a zero draft in 2024, next year. There is a preparatory commission taking place, and some good progress has been made on the UN Plastics Pollution Treaty. And in fact, there have been one or two Caribbean countries, especially Antigua and Barbuda, which sits on the governing body of that commission, to move this forward. Now, as far as the WTO is concerned, there are many delegations, and this was expressed up to today, where they feel a sense of disappointment that WTO has not done more in the area of the nexus between trade and the environment, trade and climate. The WTO actually has one of its bodies. There is a committee on trade and the environment, but there are many delegations that believe that that committee is moribund. In the past, it has met only twice a year, and many delegations are calling for this committee to be revitalized and to be refurbished more or less, and to be given a strong work program. And they're hoping that at the ministerial conference in February, that the ministers will authorize exactly that, that the Trade and Environment Committee can be revitalized and can be given a strong work program in trade and the environment. Speaking of the upcoming ministerial conference, people are looking to one of the successes that could come out of the conference to be the second phase of the fisheries subsidies agreement. The first phase was last year at the 12th ministerial conference in June last year. There was a fisheries subsidies agreement, which was deemed as a tremendous success because, in fact, negotiations had dragged on for 20 years with no agreement. But there was a breakthrough, and there was an agreement last year. And at this ministerial in February, we are looking for the second phase of the fisheries subsidies agreement. Now, why is the fisheries subsidies agreement important, especially in relation to climate? The fisheries subsidies agreement actually is seeking to discipline and reduce harmful fisheries subsidies that cause overcapacity and overfishing. And the theory is that if these subsidies are reduced or eliminated, then overcapacity among fishing fleets and overfishing will also be reduced. This relates, of course, to one of the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, 14.6, I believe. And so it is an aspect of the climate agenda that everybody knows to be very important. Ambassador Fuller mentioned CBAM, and I just want to touch on CBAM for a moment because it is also a subject of discussion here in Geneva at the WTO. The EU has just begun implementing CBAM, and the EU has discovered that there is a tremendous amount of pushback from other member states regarding the implementation of CBAM. Why? There are member states that believe it was done without sufficient notice that would give those affected time to adjust, perhaps to have a transition period, and be able to meet the requirements of CBAM without many adverse effects on their trading economy. They were also hoping that the requirements on the CBAM would not be so onerous, especially for small states, which would have difficulty in tracking the carbon output through all stages of an economic activity and a trading activity. But the EU went ahead, and now CBAM is now in effect. For the ministerial conference in February, MC13, it is also hoped that there will be a ministerial outcome document which will push climate issues further up on the trade agenda and make a strong statement on the environmental challenges that are faced by member states. What member states, of course, realize at the WTO is that, largely speaking, it's companies that trade. It is companies that pollute, not governments. Governments are being called upon to set a regulatory environment that would discipline these activities and reduce these activities without causing serious economic damage. And the same applies to the UN Plastics Treaty that I had mentioned before. It is not governments that have put plastic into the environment. It is companies, and companies have to be disciplined not to do that anymore. And many governments are beginning to come to the realization that perhaps the best way to do that is to provide incentives to companies not to do that. Because companies always look at the bottom line. And if you come with a strictly approach of banning this activity and so on, companies will not react well, or it could really have an adverse effect economically. So I just wanted to give, I think, a brief overview on what is happening, especially at the WTO, in relation to trade and climate issues. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Murdoch. I think, hearing from what yourself and Ambassador Fuller has brought to the fore the fact that the vectors, I call it vector, and forgive me, I'm an economist, but I tend to be on the econometric side, which is when one models trade, we look at what we call that vector of barriers to trade. And there seems to be an intersection between the barriers to trade. And it is those same barriers that one needs to look at very carefully as we support countries in mitigating CO2 emissions, but also the sort of goods and services needed to adapt to climate change. So what I'm seeing, and this is why yourself and Ambassador Fuller are very critical to this process of negotiation, because it is really balancing, trying to break down the barriers to trade, but also ensuring that those parameters are set at a point where it protects the environment. And I hear you. What we require is incentives, and the role of the private sector is coming through quite clearly. They need to be incentivized rather than us coming out with the hammer. But let's continue the discussion, and maybe some more of this will come out as we move forward. Let me hand over to Dr. Remy to give her intervention. Thank you again, Ambassador Murdoch.
Thank you so much, if I may, Donil, because I consider us to be friends now. And let me just say on behalf of the SRC that regularly hosts these lunchtime chats, that this is one, I think this is the first or the second for me for the year. I usually did a lot more in previous years, but I've been doing a little bit more research this year. But this was one that I considered to be absolutely critical for our region, not just because of, as we have heard, there are these obvious interstitial linkages between our policy and our economies when it comes to trade and climate policy and interactions at the economic level, but also because I think it's a signal of where the world is going in international economic governance. So the idea for this webinar, and we are hoping, I would say, Ruana, Donil, and I, that one of the outputs of this is actually going to be a dedicated workshop where we would bring together climate and trade, maybe even finance officials across CARICOM as almost as a model for other countries as well, of how to engage in more holistic, coherent decision-making. And the reason this is important to me is because it emerges from some of the research and the work and proposals I've been putting out together with other academics as part of what we call the Remaking Trade Project, where we have over the past year engaged in almost 10 workshops with about 400 participants, and Donil was at one of those, and this is actually where the idea was ignited for this. But what we realize is that climate people are talking to climate, environment people more generally are talking to each other, gender people are talking to each other, and trade people are talking to each other. And there's now a complete rebalancing of the agendas, because there was a time when I got into trade where trade was a very unifying force, but also, let's say, had pride of place in international economic governance. And what we're witnessing now is a grand leveling. In fact, I would say there's almost uprooting of trade as being the major place in international commerce and governance where decisions impacting the sustainability and ultimately the economic agendas are taking place. All of that to say that we feel this is an opportunity that the world is actually kind of, as reflected in the SDGs, that the world is cottoning on to. And we believe that CARICOM can, as I mentioned, be a powerful opportunity among our different communities to bring discussions on this together. So what I want to do in my remaining time is sort of just talk. I think Ambassador Murdoch gave a really great overview of what's happening at the general overview level or the higher level. I want to think about what some of these intersections mean for CARICOM policymaking and political engagement, as well as technical redefining of priorities, or instead of redefining, but bringing closer together more coherent approaches to decision making and economic planning. So I think we often hear about trade and climate in the context of the clashes taking place between these two regimes. Ambassador mentioned the EU's carbon border adjustment mechanism. This is where it fits really into discussions happening in committees. How do governments' unilateral attempts to discipline and to further their climate intentions, how are these having impacts, whether intended or not, on trade and market access opportunities for other countries? It's not just happening in CBAM. We're seeing this approach to unilateral decision-making coming out of the EU Green Deal and the Fit for 55 approaches by the EU in the deforestation initiative, also in other things like the due diligence regulations, all unilaterally set by the EU. But the US and China are also doing similar things in order to promote their own agendas on climate, often thought of as protectionist because they do so at the expense of other producers, but they do serve a climate goal, which is to reduce emissions through subsidizations we know from the US and their new IRA objectives and their new plans where they are subsidizing production of electric vehicles that has dislocating effects for other industries in other countries, obviously. So this is the negative connotation that is usually associated between trade, and this is just one formulation of that. We also know that the EU and the US are engaged in negotiations to try to deal with some of the issues with China and Chinese production through negotiation of compatible standards as it relates to steel and aluminum trade. These are not necessarily going well, but again, these are attempts that a lot of people say are part of a broader geopolitical tension happening that impact trade relations and dislocate trading patterns to the often with effects that developing countries like ours just cannot keep up with. At the WTO, some of the technical work happening is at the level of the Secretariat. The Secretariat is doing a lot more technical work on things like standards. The ambassador spoke about the standards that underpinning sort of carbon pricing and also standards that have to be complied with in order to meet carbon emissions. But we're also hearing increasingly about business having to actually comply with standards pursuant to due diligence requirements. And these standards operate at all levels of the global value chain, whether it's taking the fish out of the water all the way to the labeling for consumers. What is the carbon? And it's not just carbon, there's a broader sustainability agenda. What is the carbon emission? How are labor standards being impacted? Are there human rights abuses happening? So these are forcing smaller players to reckon with their inadequate infrastructures when it comes to measuring carbon emissions, verifying them, and ultimately complying with them. Now, this is a huge issue that we as smaller island developing states actually have to grapple with as part of this trade and climate and broader sustainability agenda begin to intersect. We see it happening also at the level of international organizations. For the first time ever, we are going to have at COP28 a dedicated environmental, sort of meeting of heads of government and trade and environmental officials, a trade day, again signifying that trade has become really integral to thinking about these issues. The WTO has issued a World Trade Report dedicated to climate change. There are member-led, not multilateral, but plurilateral among like-minded countries, negotiations on fossil fuel negotiations and subsidies, plastics, as the ambassador mentioned. Our own economies have brought to the fore, in the context of the Committee on Trade and Development, natural disasters and the impacts, and whether there are ways that there are flexibilities in trade rules to deal with the economic dislocations that happen every time we have a hurricane, and how can the trade sectors that are impacted actually get greater flexibility among WTO members. We have an increasing kind of creeping in of a broader ocean and blue economy. a work program. There's no holistic approach to the blue economy yet. Yet, as Ambassador Murdoch said, we are looking at fossil fuel subsidies and thinking about, in a climate context, how our fisheries managements, how are all of the other ways we manage our fisheries impacted by the growing problems we have with climate change, and how dislocating again that has the stocks of fisheries that we depend on as artisanal communities in terms of our livelihoods and also our export opportunities. So there's a lot of cross sections that are happening at the WTO that we need to think about, and I haven't even gone into finance. The WTO is not even really considered to be a finance organization, but it's very hard to think of climate and trade without that huge dimension of such importance to CARICOM. This is one of our #1 demands, is the transition that has to be sort of undergirded by flows of finance at effective, cost-effective rates. And this is what the whole Bridgetown agenda is. Are there ways that we can think of using aid for trade or trade finance rules in the context of the WTO that will actually promote the needs of the global South and allow the just transition to happen? Another issue that has come up in some of the negotiations is, how do we enable the transfer of technologies to green technologies? Do we follow the lead of the waiver of waiving IP rights when it comes to climate technologies that will allow us to indulge in and engage in more renewable technologies that we need? Because right now, that unidirection coming into our region is not happening, but because it's too expensive, as I think was mentioned before, to make that transition just on the basis of commercial rates and commercial attractiveness of our smaller regions. I know I'm already exhausted my time, but I do want to focus in on what I thought I started off saying is, what is the Caribbean take on all of this? We mentioned already our real concern with how finance can be used in order to promote our objectives at the WTO, but also more in the climate negotiations. But are there ways that we can actually use the agenda to our advantage, this climate and trade intersection more to our advantage in ways that actually can benefit us? And now I know Ambassador Fuller and Ruana and some others of you who are on this call are actually in Panama. And when I looked at the Latin America and Caribbean Climate Week, which is a prelude to COP28 for our region and Latin America, a lot of the topics bear so much resonance to what is being discussed at the WTO. The blue economy and carbon markets, carbon pricing. The WTO Director General just set up a commission on carbon pricing. Is there a way we can get to a broader global carbon price, so that at least when we're thinking about how CBAM will operate and how countries actually price that pollution, that we can all agree on a basic level? And there is a lot of, I know, political jockeying on this. Entrepreneurship, agricultural policy, where's the WTO on food security, and how do we use all of the discussions happening in order to enhance food security, which is a big issue as a result of land use practices that actually operate also in the climate discussions to disadvantage us. So I have 3 solutions that I want to put before you. The first one is, I think we need to get out of our silos. And this is an attempt to do it at a more technical level. It has to actually bubble up to a more political engagement. COTED is a place where our ministers of environment and trade actually meet in that context. Why don't we have a joint COTED meeting where there's a political engagement that is then filtered up at the level of the prime ministers at conferences, at the conference of heads of governments, where we're actually not just aligning our agendas across finance, environment, trade, climate, agriculture, but also coming up with political statements like the Africans did. They just had an African Climate Summit where at least the world knew they were serious about it and they were bringing all the agendas together. we are leading on Bridgetown agenda. I think we should also lead on climate. At the a level of the technical work, we do need to begin framing a lot of the discussions and the follow-on developmental agendas, either the CDB, the 5Cs, all of those who actually do the work on the ground of implementing climate and development policies. We need to include trade, first of all. Trade is not even seen on a lot of the strategic documents because it's seen still as an outsider to this discussion. But we need to bring our technical people together to see where the interlinkages are across our priorities. And I have very specific examples, but I'm running out of time. We also need to think very concretely about how to use trade agreements that we are currently negotiating. If you look on the trade vista of CARICOM, we just negotiated or had discussions with the US, with Canada, with Africa. How much is climate policy actually becoming front and center there? How do we actually use market access provisions to ensure that environmental goods and services from the region that need to be actually promoted, actually get an opportunity to be promoted? How do we align standards between our export markets so that they can pay for some of the sustainability transitions that we need? And finally, I think we also need to broaden our advocacy across all of the dimensions. We know about the strength of advocacy happening in the climate negotiations. We have prime ministers, we have the executive secretary of climate occupying positions that are from the Caribbean, occupying very important positions. But we need to broaden our advocacy. At the WTO, we have our ambassadors doing a great job, but we all need to be on the same page. And advocacy, as the ambassador mentioned, in the context of climate litigation, we have lawyers from the region who can use our developmental priorities as part of litigation before the ICJ, before the ITLOS, etc. And we should all be talking with each other. So I'm sorry for taking so long. You can see I'm really animated about this. I see a lot of opportunities that I didn't get into for technical intersection and more work together. But I will look forward to greater discussion from the participants. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Genevieve. Yes, this is just the beginning. This webinar really is about, starting to bring together the two thematic areas for greater discussion, collaboration, and work. So, beyond this, I'm hoping we're going to roll up our sleeves and put together tangible actions that could really advance, as I said at the top of this webinar, the agendas, which is, both geared towards increasing welfare gains to the persons on this planet. Let me hand over to Ruana to give her intervention, and then once Ruana is done, I'll open up the floor for some discussion. Ruana?
Thank you, Doniel, and hi, everybody. It's difficult to come after the list of speakers that we just had. I'm not sure what else remains to be said on these issues in terms of how we understand the intersections between trade and climate change. Maybe I will focus my remarks a bit to drill down some on what's actually being discussed in the climate change space, and some implications of that discussion for how we might want to deal with this as a joined up issue going forward. Because I do endorse Janive's recommendations around how do we move forward with climate and trade agenda for the region that delivers for the region across both areas in a manner that is complementary but not competitive. So one question that I wanted to throw out is around this idea of the international trading system. And the question is, has the international trading system delivered for CARICOM countries? Has it delivered? What has it delivered? is what it has delivered enough that from our perspective, we need to be advocating for it to be protected, or is it rather that we need to be advocating for it to change? So within the climate discussion, we've recently started this discussion around the just transition, which I think more than any other singular thematic issue that we've addressed in the climate space really creates a platform for being able to understand how these issues interact with each other in a much more holistic way around climate, trade, finance, the international financial system, and how it functions, development as a whole. One of the reasons why there is right now apparently a bit duplication, and two, a bit of mismatch between what countries or large trading blocs like the EU are doing in support of their climate objectives and broader multilateral trade regime, is because there really just has not been a space where any of these issues are being discussed together. And so, of course, countries, trading blocs with the economic power and with enough incentive actually have had absolutely no constraints on going off and designing and implementing these types of unilateral approaches without the adequate level of consultation. As we heard earlier, there has not been really the space to have this discussion. From a developing country perspective, there's a great interest in being able to have this discussion in the context of the climate change regime. And in fact, this has squarely been put forward and put onto the table by developing countries. And maybe unsurprisingly, our developed country partners are less interested in having this discussion in that context. And, you know, various reasons are being put forward for this, that it's you know, these are issues to be worked out in a bilateral manner, or these are issues that can be discussed in the context of the WTO. But has the discussion in the WTO had any kind of constraining effect, or any effect at all on what has been done? And the other question is, you know, if you think about economic power and leverage, what value is there in trying to have this discussion in a bilateral manner with these countries, with these blocs, especially from the perspective of CARICOM countries? I mean, we live in this space of, you know, unequal or inequality when it comes to negotiation leverage, in particular when it comes to questions around trade, right? This is a reality. On the other hand, in the context of the climate space, the premise and the basis upon which we have discussions there is that each country is sovereign but equal, and it is much more of a level playing field, notwithstanding the existing you know, economic imbalances outside of the climate process. But within that process, and as we have seen over the years in its existence, where small island developing states have been able to play an outsized role, and that role is outsized in relation to our relative economic power because of the way that discussion is organized. So my premise here is that the Just Transition Work Program that is recently launched in the context of the climate discussion holds a tremendous amount of potential, as a space where these issues can be brought to the fore in the first instance, and in the second instance, as a space where the specific circumstances of small island developing states, in particular those from the Caribbean, but small island developing states globally, can also be elevated in that discussion. Because what we have seen is where just transition has been negotiated in a more plurilateral setting. So for example, coming out of Glasgow in 2021, we had just transition energy packages, right? And given to South Africa and now being expanded to other countries. And, you know, there's no SIDS country that has been considered for one of these multi-billion-dollar investment packages for the just transition. And you have to ask yourself, why is that, right? Because the nature of the discussion where these emerged was not a multilateral one. And what we have seen as SIDS is that as soon as we get away from the multilateral space, our needs fall by the wayside because of all of the circumstances that are attached to us and because of the reality of smallness in the context of the global economy. So the way forward, I think right now, we're in a very exciting space because of the possibilities that exist. I agree that what we need to be doing as a region is preparing ourselves to actually enter the discussion in a way that we influence the discussion and not in a way that we sit ready to receive the outcomes of those discussions. I can see already that even in the context of the emerging just transition discussion, small island developing states have some ground to cover to ensure that our voices are being adequately heard. It is not yet seen as an issue for SIDS. So there is some ground to be covered there. And I think that I would very, very much want to endorse what Janive said in terms of being able to expand the discussion in a way that touches on all of the relevant issues that are key for us. And one that I haven't heard as yet, for example, is this question of, we're talking about trade and the trading system and the agreements that we sign. But when we start to think about finance, and also when we start to think about the emerging role of the private sector and companies, investment is also going to be key, right? And thinking about how our bilateral investment treaties and the provisions within those treaties actually have an enabling effect on what we know we need to do to protect our societies from the climate crisis, I think is a huge gap also that needs to be addressed. But generally, this whole question of the role of the private sector and the role of these multinational companies is one that is cross-cutting and that we need to be able to grapple with as well, and that we need to be able to place squarely on all of the relevant agenda that exists. So I'll stop here because I'm really eager to hear what the audience has to say and for us to engage in a bit of discussion. Back over to you, Daniel.
Thank you very much, Rona. And thank you very much, panelists, for the presentations that have gone before. But I think it's important that we hear from our audience, we hear from the persons in the room. Or if you have any questions, I think you could go ahead and raise your hand or place them in the chat. Are we monitoring the chat as well?
I think there's one question there by David Gomez. That's quite a detailed one.
And it's to you.
But as we absorb, Donil, as we absorb David's great question, I did want to use my prerogative as a panelist to just, if I may, just to have a very short counterpoint in agreement with Ruana. on some of the politics behind the SIDS. But I see everybody, we're trying to read David's question, so maybe Chair, it's up to you. Let me see.
Ed, I'm reading his question in the meantime. So once you're
Okay.
done, I could come back to you.
Okay, so one of the things that I was really I had in my notes to say, but I didn't, even though I overshot my time, was Ruana makes a really important point about not just the politics and advocacy around SIDS and their different perception in the climate negotiations. But also the legal standing that they have by virtue of them being recognized, in addition to LDCs, as a special subcategory of developing countries. And I think that legal imprimatur of being deserving of special attention in the climate stage or in the climate arena is directly and in marked contrast to how we are treated in the broader WTO negotiations, and not for want of trying. I know all the way back in Doha in 2001 in the Doha developmental agenda, there was an attempt by small and vulnerable economies to create a subcategory. And it was granted with a condition that they would not themselves be a separate category that would be recognized as such in the negotiations. And although our ambassadors and our technical people have managed to get through certain dispensations from the trade rules because there's an agreement that we are vulnerable, we still, I don't think, are recognized as separate and apart and as a separate negotiating group that gets the benefits that LDCs, least developed countries, naturally get in any negotiation at the WTO. And I think what we can learn from climate, and certainly these are the areas where I think it's not just the politics, it's just strategic interconnections between our communities that we really have to leverage. How do we use that bargaining power of a separate categorization accepted in climate in order to bring greater awareness to our different political and legal and technical positions at the WTO? We don't have to fight. There's a huge fight at the WTO for who are developing countries. And nobody would expect St. Lucia, Grenada to be in the same category as India. And so I think if we can use some of the huge gains we've made in environment in service of our positioning at the WTO, this is something we can learn from. This is something I put forward in things I've written, and I don't want to be self-promotional, but Ruana, myself, and another colleague, we wrote a piece about a year ago called Initial Considerations for CARICOM in Trade and Climate Negotiations that I think is really worth taking back up and looking to see where the possibility for greater strategic engagement might lie. I just wanted to kind of put that forward.
David, I'm coming to you shortly, but I see Ambassador Murdoch. Is it in connection to that point here, Ambassador?
Yes, it is, quite
Go ahead.
frankly. I just wanted to comment a bit on what Jani just said. I wanted to endorse what she said about the SIDS and their role in the international trading system. But at the WTO, the words or the phrase SIDS is hardly ever heard. It's not a category. And the closest you're going to get is SVEs. So the Caribbean countries, the OECS countries are in the SVEs group. But the SVEs group, in my view, is not really a comfortable fit for the Caribbean countries for SIDS. When I go to a SVEs group meeting, I sit down next to Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka has a population of 25 million people. So, I mean, there's just no way that we should be in the same group. But I have to say, there is what I call category fatigue at the WTO. They don't want to hear it. It's as simple as that. Many arguments are made about SIDS, about special and differential treatment, small states, and so on. And it's just, you know, I got to tell you that the delegates, their eyes glaze over, especially the delegates from the developed world. And there's another problem with SDT, special and differential treatment. I don't think anybody, philosophically or conceptually, disagrees with special and differential treatment for SIDS, small island developing states from the Caribbean, CARICOM, OECS. I think the case is clear. The problem is that special and differential treatment applies to all developing countries. And you can self-designate as a developing country in the WTO. So that, for instance, China is a developing country because they have self-designated as a developing country. So the developed countries see that, if I give special and differential treatment to SIDS in the Caribbean or the Pacific or wherever, what that really means is that I also have to give it to China. And my brother, they're not giving it to China because China and the United States are right now in a great geopolitical struggle. And that struggle plays out quite often within the WTO. So that's the problem. The problem of SIDS is connected to the problem of SDT and its flexibilities and the self-designation as a developing country, which means basically the SDT, which is given to St. Lucia and Grenada, you also have to give it to China, unless China opts out. And that's a huge problem. It's a huge problem that is just not being resolved right now at the WTO.
Yeah, thank you very much, Ambassador Murdoch. Ambassador Fuller, connected to this, because we do have two questions.
Thanks, Daniil. I wanted to touch on three things that Jean-Yves mentioned. The first one having to do with the silos. I agree totally. We need to move away from that and get, when a country goes to negotiations, they go into, they should cover everything, not have one position in Geneva, a different position in New York, and a different position in London. Obviously, you should have the same position, and we need to move away from that. And part of it is our fault. You mentioned quoted, and for some reason, we have quoted trade, quoted environment, quoted climate. It should be one quoted, where you can discuss anything. Yes, you have an agenda item, but you should be able to discuss any issue as opposed to, sorry, I'm not talking about that today. No, we should change that issue. And then the final issue, the special circumstances of SIDS. And I think that is where we as climate change negotiators have failed. I say that because SIDS and LDCs were mentioned in the convention, but the LDCs said, let me work on that issue. And they created an agenda item on LDCs. They went to the GEF and they created a special fund for LDCs. We have never done that for SIDS. I think that is a failure on our part, and we should address that issue because indeed, SIDS was the driving force behind the Climate Change Convention, and yet we never articulated any special window for us. And I think that's an area we need to address. Thanks.
Thanks, Ambassador. We need to get the participants involved, and we have here a question from David. David, I've allowed you to unmute your mic. You want to go ahead and ask your question?
Yeah, well, thanks, Daniil, and thanks to the organizers for this forum today. I mean, I articulated it there in the question, but I can just read it through. I think basically it had to be to deal with food security in the context of climate change, especially because CARICOM has designated this as a critical issue for the region. But research shows, especially in the Uxbridge nexus, that land biosphere carbon sink is viewed as the major source of uncertainty in future climate change projections. And I was just wondering, because Yannis mentioned the matter of food security and land use when she started speaking. whether land use management, and that involves whether the decision whether to protect the land, to manage it for agriculture use, or to restore land, and this afforestation is a big issue. Whether that potentially impacts on agriculture in the CARICOM region, because agriculture is one of the greatest sources of land use carbon emissions, but also because land use management in the context of climate change has implications for whether or not we're able to preserve the economic space for agriculture in the region. Given, especially given the food security has been flagged as an important issue. I just wanted to find out whether or not CARICOM is thinking anything along that line, or if it's just moving ahead saying that's food security and we're moving ahead on that. So I've found that as some of you have been saying in your recent interventions, that the failure to put issues on the agenda is perhaps the major failing of our ability to get results out of these negotiations. And I just wondered if maybe land use is something that we need to start looking at, because developed countries are beginning to look at it, especially in the context of net zero. So.
Before you come in and answer that one, Genevieve, I think I want, if you have an answer, and maybe Dr. Fuller or Rana on the climate change side, what is happening as it relates to land use and that element, especially at the CARICOM. But there was also that question around intellectual property, which is very much connected to the sort of technologies and that sort of thing. If we could just speak to that when you come in almost immediately. Over.
Ambassador Fuller, you have your hand up. Does that mean you have an answer?
Yes, in fact, I wanted to touch on those two.
Okay, go
right
ahead.
Go after you.
Okay.
You.
So certainly. So within the climate change negotiations, we now have an agenda item dealing with agriculture, both at the technical level by SBSTA and at the implementation level. And in fact, just this year, we began negotiating on a new work program dealing with agriculture. And it was good to see that some of our agricultural people are now attending, because this is where you set the agenda for a work program on agriculture. And as David mentioned, CARICOM has said that agriculture and food security is the #1 priority now for the Caribbean, and especially come out of COVID. We need to address that issue. The 25 by 30, is very important for us, and I think this provides that context for us to ensure that under the Climate Change Convention, we both address the issue of adapting our agriculture to the new climate, but then also reducing emissions from the agricultural sector, because that is also significant. And especially if we have to deal with the carbon border adjustment taxes, how do we ensure our agricultural products are as environmentally friendly as possible and meets international standards, both in quality, taste, and also in emissions, and ensuring that indeed the land we have in agriculture is as productive as possible, so we don't have to clear new land where Belize, Guyana, Suriname have a lot of land, but we would certainly like to maintain it as a sink. So how do we make the existing agricultural lands as productive as possible? So that is certainly one area we need to look at. Under intellectual property rights, where that is really discussed is under the technology transfer and development process. And that's an area where, as developing countries, we keep emphasizing the need that as we collaborate with the developed countries in developing these new technologies that are going to be carbon, low in carbon, but also adapting to the new climate, we indeed share in the profits that can be coming out of it, using the TRIPS, for example, agreements as an example of how we should do that into the climate change space. Thanks.
If I can, I don't know, Ambassador Murdoch, if you wanted to jump in on the WTO side before I do.
Actually, yes. And to make a more general point as well. What I wanted to make a general point about diplomacy, whether it's climate diplomacy, trade diplomacy, whatever it is, political diplomacy. To influence the decisions, you have to be in the room where the decisions are made. It's as simple and as basic as that. So you have to go to the major conferences where these decisions are taken. You have to be at the World Economic Forum. You have to be at the IMF. You have to be at the World Bank at the annual meetings. You have to be at the OECD. You have to be at the G20. These are where the important decisions, especially relating to climate and to finance, are made. And if you're not there, then your influence is reduced. Now, Ruana made a point regarding a kind of almost outsized influence that Caribbean countries have in climate negotiations. And I think that's true. And I think it's true because Caribbean countries have prioritized climate negotiations. They attend in force, almost all of them go to the COPs, and they negotiate actively and robustly. And they don't do that equally in the other spheres, which goes to show you can have an influence if you dedicate diplomatic time and effort to influencing the decisions where the decisions are made. You know, actually, I'm surprised nobody has mentioned, we haven't gotten onto the finance so much yet. The efforts relating to the multidimensional vulnerability index at the United Nations. Considerable diplomatic effort has gone into that as well. The Bridgetown Initiative. These are things that I think we really need to grab with both our hands from a diplomatic point of view and run with them in the places where the decisions are made. Issuing a communique and so on is one thing, but actually being in the room, actually attending the particular conference, even if it is meeting decision makers in the lobby or side meetings or whatever, this is how it's done. I'm sorry, this is how it's done. And but there are a number of very interesting things that are bubbling up, even if it's, including the multidimensional vulnerability index. Belize, maybe Carlos can speak to this a bit, is doing something very interesting with their blue bonds. So, and I think these are things that can generate interest in the international community. So I'm just trying to say that we need to get our foot in the door, and we need to be in the places where the decisions that affect us are being taken.
Ambassador Murdoch, you raise a very interesting, and I just want to use this time to just ask that, and it's a very naive question on the part of the trade side. You speak to the strong negotiating power of the climate change group, and I want to take some credit, not me, the 5 C's, for coordinating that approach. As Ambassador Fuller just mentioned, there was a pre-COP meeting in Miami, and the 5 C's organized quite a few of these meetings where we bring the negotiators together. What's happening on the trade side? Are the negotiators coming together in such a systematic approach, coming up with one position and moving into the WTO space? Is that happening systematically?
Ambassador?
Well, I was going to give a one-word answer, but well, to tell you the truth, I would be less than honest if I said yes, that it's coming together and so on. Somehow I get the feeling in our region, in CARICOM circles and so on, that trade is regarded as something arcane and obscure. Sorry, Jenny. That, it's about tariffs and subsidies and countervailing duties. And, ministers don't like that very much. It's not something they can really, sink their teeth into quite readily and run with it. So I find that quite often the strong interest is not there. Now, for instance, right now, I left the meeting to come here. to do this. There is the senior officials meeting at the WTO, where the Director General is asking for all the trade senior officials to come from Capital, to come to Geneva, sit down for 2 days, and see if we can achieve some kind of momentum going into the ministerial conference in February. And for the CARICOM region, the level of persons they were looking for is what the Director General Ngozi called vice ministers. That's what they call in Latin American country, which is really the permanent secretary level in our system. The highest level just under the minister. And quite frankly, from our region, there were no permanent secretaries. There were no persons at that level. First, the attendance was a bit sparse. Just a handful of countries sent anybody at all. And the persons they sent were usually directors of trade in the ministry, some senior official responsible for some aspect of trade, but the kind of person that Director General Ngozi was looking for in our region, no one fit that description. From the OECS, we had 2 senior officials attend, 1 ambassador from St. Lucia and 1 director of international trade from Antigua. And that was it. And that's pretty much how it looked around the whole Caribbean for this meeting. So I think quite often, it's almost like trade is regarded as too specialist, too complicated, just too abstruse and recondite. I love that word.
Well, thank you very much for that. I think it goes back to the point that you make about, making quoted work more effectively and efficiently. And so we could have the right representation in those rooms and a position on these issues. Genevieve, I saw you wanted to respond to one of the queries from.
Yeah, but just to sort of put a finer point on what the ambassador said about trade, I'm seeing a note from Rihanna, maybe just to the panelists, that climate was also seen as sort of a very specific, kind of not very sexy topic a few years ago. And I would say that the zeitgeist certainly has now moved demonstrably to climate and the environment, and it is now the sexy thing to be in. And I think what you're seeing is literally a retooling of trade experts and those of us who have kind of seen the change in the direction and in the wind vein are trying now to tool ourselves with sustainability credentials. And even the Director General speaking more on that platform of the WTO as promoting sustainability and sustainable outcomes is what you're seeing. And what's happening at CARICOM is also you hear from trade officials all over the world that they're no longer dealing with bread and butter tariff issues and subsidies issues, although they are dealing with it. I think the difference is that climate and the environment and the sustainability agenda is creeping into everything else. You can't talk about trade now without talking about the subsidies to the sustainability industries as well. So it's not, I don't think it's watertight anymore. I think we all have to become generalists, and we all now need to understand from our own perspectives how the things begin to intersect, and that's the value of these kinds of discussions. So I think bearing that in mind, one of the things we are doing in the work I'm doing is to make trade part of the sustainability solution. The trade cannot stand anymore on the sidelines and say it's not involved in the existential challenges of our time. Trade cannot just say we're getting out of the way. It actually needs to now begin retooling its processes and its rules to be more sustainable. I saw a question now that I don't know, Caleb. It's a very interesting question. I'm not sure that I'm getting my mind around it, which is this idea of the Morris Tomlinson case and discriminatory treatment in that case on the basis of the homosexuality of somebody trying to get in. It's a Belizean case and Trinidad case where Tomlinson argued that he was being discriminated against contrary to the revised Treaty of Chaguaramas in entering Belize and Trinidad and Tobago. And certainly the case didn't go in his favor ultimately, but a lot of the discussions were useful in thinking about how the RTC, the revised Treaty of Chaguaramas, can actually be used in the service of ventilating some of these non-economic issues, social issues that impact free movement, which is an economic issue. And I'm curious, Caleb, how you see us being able to use, even I think in the terms of migration across the region as a result of climate, are there rights that certain regions affected by climate change may have in asking and calling for non-discriminatory treatment? Can we think of retooling some of the rights under the revised treaty as climate rights that can now be the subject of cases brought against member states that impact in a nefarious way the ability of economic operators to operate within CARICOM? I haven't thought about it, but it's a very interesting dimension that would marry my predisposition towards regional law with international law. And there's another discussion or comment. I absolutely agree, Anonymous, that of course treating SIDS as China is a non-starter, and it does argue in favor of having the political momentum to seek out that subcategorization of SIDS. The problem Ambassador Murdoch highlighted is you then don't know what other subcategories in trade will be opened up for discussion. And I think in holding the line, they're doing a great disservice to those of us most in need of protection by international trade law. And the last question that I want to just is Ram Merchandi. So this is a more general question about trade facilitation and hardship of importers. Completely agree that we need to focus on that more. And I would just say that in the context to bring it home to our discussion, in the context of discussions relating to natural disasters and emergencies, a lot of the discussion now is how do we make sure that the rules are able to deal with facilitating entry of professionals and persons in the aftermath of a disaster as a result of climate change, or we can facilitate safe passage and quicker, lanes of clearance of border goods and these sorts of things in the context and that of a disaster. And that will require greater infrastructure, greater automation, single windows in the way we process goods and services, especially after a disaster. So I hope we answered all the questions, O'Neill. I know you were keen on getting it, and I'll stop there. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. I don't see any other questions, but I think it's important, and I'm going to wrap up now and then just hand to the panelists a quick minute or two just to give some last statements, and then we close. But I taking Ram's question there and just putting something out here. We're talking about, again, barriers to trade that existed before climate change, right? Before climate change was on the radar. And there are these issues around, tariffs, other development challenges, corruptions, and those sort of things at port of entries and that sort of thing. These are all barriers to trade facilitation and trade taking place. And then you take the issues of climate change that are emerging, and you need to deal with CO2 emissions and adapt. And it adds another complexity to the models. Of all the trade models I've looked at, I think I've only seen one. I'm trying not to use the acronym, and one model that has integrated trade consideration with climate change into a mathematical general equilibrium solution. That has not happened. Our thinking in the Caribbean has not evolved to that level. On the frontier of trade research, and I go back to a model that is quoted over and over, which is Mellett's model, which talks about market share being reallocated to the most productive firms. Genevieve mentioned the idea of us being struck by hurricanes. Firms invest in their economic activities under uncertainty. The future climate adds another complexity to that uncertainty. Unless your production level get to a certain, this is what the model suggests, to a certain level, you will not become an exporter. Our private sector in the region is already small, and now having to grapple with the impacts of climate change and also compete in an international market is one that we grapple with. Now, adding on to that, things around standards and so forth, it adds another layer of complexity, one that we as a region have to come together to solve, again, taking into consideration the nature of our private sector, the characteristics of our private sector. And it is a complex interlock of elements that we need to bring together to figure out what is important. And then, of course, you know, countries are heterogeneous, they're not homogeneous, and so it's not a one-size-fits-all approach that's going to work here. Last point I want to say, the point about regional agreements and how they work for us, trade agreements, how they work for us. One of the things that emerged is that, and if you take a look at the architecture of the regional trade agreement for CARICOM, it was geared towards protecting some of the most vulnerable islands in our region, the small economies in our region. And I must say, it is doing that. Effective, one might say not so effective, and it could be improved. But the intention was that, how can we leverage regional trade agreements to our benefits in the space of addressing climate change mitigation and adaptation measures? Let me say thank you very much, everybody. Let me hand over to the panelists, each a minute or two just to close out. Ambassador Fuller.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kane, and thank you to everyone for organizing this session. I just want to close off by saying, when I began in the climate change process decades ago, to age myself, we had maybe 2,000 persons attending a COP. Now we're talking 40,000 to 50,000, maybe this year 80,000 will be going. So indeed, an environmental issue has now become a global issue. The Paris Agreement was a reset, and that is where we as CARICOM countries have to use the reset. We have gone back to zero. Let's now approach it the right way. We kept saying that I've heard some countries say, well, you know, developed countries achieve their level of development using petroleum, so give us that space. I say no, that was wrong. Let us do it the right way from the beginning. We don't need an intermediate stop to do so. And as Caleb mentioned, this thing covers everyone. So now we speak about the human rights issue of climate change. We speak about gender. We speak about indigenous peoples and local communities. So it has to be an inclusive process. Everyone has a lot to contribute to this global reset. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Fuller. Ambassador Murdoch.
Thank you. I just want to make one or two very quick points, and that is, you know, on trade and climate, we need to start in the region with our regional institutions, quoted, let us say. My personal view is that quoted is a very dysfunctional institution. And I think more and more there's frustration with quoted. Nothing is ever resolved at quoted. Companies take their issues to quoted to try and get things worked out, and it just keeps going on, and eventually they go to the CCJ and get a decision, you know? And I think this is what is happening also on climate as well, internationally. Member states get frustrated with what is happening diplomatically and with the structures up there, and then they start to do international litigation to get a decision, a legal decision. And we have it at the WTO also, where as you know, the United States has paralyzed the appellate body of the dispute settlement system by simply refusing to appoint any new judges. So as judges retire, the body gradually becomes inchoate. Then they don't have enough judges to sit. And the US refuses to do anything about it. There's a resolution which has 130 signatories on it at the WTO. It has been presented 30 times, and 30 times the US says no. And they're just holding the entire body hostage because they don't agree. But the last point I want to make is next year in May, there is the 4th SID Summit. Now, a SID Summit is held only once every 10 years. And I think this is a tremendous opportunity for SIDS. It will be a platform for SIDS to generate support for all the climate issues that we have. And I believe it will be well attended at a high level by many countries. And I think from now, we need to start focusing on the SID Summit next year. The last one was in Samoa in 2014. So I think this is a golden opportunity in terms of climate and SIDS for us to really get our message out there and influence the decision makers. And thank you for this forum. Genevieve. Thank you
very much, Ambassador Murdoch. I'm going to go to Rihanna and have Genevieve close out, especially because, Geneva, the 3 points that you made as recommendation, I want you to reiterate those, and I'll close off right after. Rihanna?
Thank you, Daniil, and it was great being a part of this discussion. Definitely a learning exercise for me, and I hope that we can keep discussions like these going. Maybe I'll wrap up with 2 points. The first one is that it is very clear that we need to design and define a regional trade and climate agenda. The issues are pressing and consequential, and we are running out of time. There's a time factor here that we need to consider in terms of this being a critical decade for climate action, and 2030 being a deadline in many ways, and which means that the period we're in now, we are likely to see a lot of changes, a lot of action happening that will be impacting us in various ways. And so we're already behind time. The second is that, and I'm very glad that Ambassador Murdoch mentioned the 4th SIDS conference that will be held next year in Antigua and Barbuda. We need to, as SIDS, be able to take a more intersectional approach to how we speak about our special case. So, when we had the Rio Convention and that process way back when, 1994, where we started the SIDS Sustainable Development process, SIDS were recognized as a special case for environment and development. Over the years, we've seen this idea eroded in some ways, but also advanced in others. I think we need to take hold of it much more firmly going forward and expand it in the ways that it needs to be expanded to deal with the new situation that we're in globally. I think what we have now, although it works partially in some areas, so we have some operation of the special circumstances of SIDS in the climate space, for example. It works partially in some areas, but it is not fit for purpose for the scale of the challenges that we're dealing with now. And we need to be able to advance on this moving forward. So thanks a lot. Back to you, Daniel.
Thank you very much. Jan?
Yeah, thank you so much. And thank you, everybody, for staying till the end, most of the participants, and to my fellow panelists. I have 3 points to make. The first one is, this agenda is dizzying. It is very hard to keep up with everything happening at the technical level within our own silos. Far less trying to understand how any of it intersects with the other work that's happening. Just last week in Dubai, there was the World Investment Forum, and investment is coming up with a new approach to climate and giving more regulatory space. Rana was just saying that investment is an underdeveloped area in our thinking in CARICOM. And this is work we're also doing at my center, bringing together ISDS people. So it's so hard to keep up with all of it. And I think the antidote is, I love hearing from my fellow experts. I loved hearing from Ambassador Fuller. I know Ambassador Murdoch in trade, but Rwanda is always a delight to work with you and Donil 5Cs. We need to lend each other the time as well as the technical expertise we need to do our jobs well. And our political directorate needs to recognize that they need to come together and give us the direction we need to do the work that's going to advance our people and our economies, because we are doing it in the trenches, but we need the higher ups to point us in the direction and let us know that the work we're doing is actually being managed in a process that is going to be mutually enforcing and coherent. So my suggestion is a COTED that brings together what we've been talking about and a very specific agenda that starts the conversation in the intersectionalities that Rana just mentioned. And beyond that, a bigger agenda at the level of political heads, prime ministers, many of whom are in charge of finance and can see that the way forward is to align the financial with the sustainability, with the trade, with the investment, with the environment, with the women's issues, and so that we're all in our small region making a big impact beyond our individual spaces. So these are areas I think we have started the discussion. We have to continue. Those of you here with the political levers to power, bring the message forward. We need to start talking and learning from each other. Thanks.
Well, thank you very much, Jan. I feel, as you said, I am dizzy because there's so many moving parts that you know, so much so we didn't even touch on finance in the depth that it should go. I know Ambassador Murdoch did raise the issue of the Blue-Green Bank, you know, the Bridgetown Initiative and how that fits in. This requires further dialogue. This requires further engagement, and it also requires bringing in even some other persons from other ministries, such as those from the ministries of finance, to support this effort going forward. I am really happy to have been a part of a webinar of this sort, and I can see where there are many work packages that could emerge from something of this nature. I do agree with you. We need to get COTED to operate more effective and efficient in setting the agenda across the different thematic areas, whether it be investment, trade, climate change, for us to be able to move forward. But in the interim, the technocrats must continue to operate within the parameter with which they are given, which is my philosophy and how I work, and I try to optimize as best as possible. And I want to suggest to all the other technocrats online that that is what we will continue to do. And of course, shape recommendations for improving the environment in which we operate. Ambassador Fuller, Ambassador Murdoch, thank you very much for your insight. Rana, Jenny, thank you very much as well. To the staff of your institute, SRC, who is behind the scenes coordinating, thank you very much for supporting. Participants who are here, many of you, admittedly, I actually don't know a lot of the persons in the room, which means there are some trade people here. And so I'm happy that we were able to bring together climate change and trade persons, and this is not the first and last. In fact, we are hoping with support from persons, and I don't know if anybody in the audience could support us in moving this, probably hosting a side event at the COP, where we could probably continue this dialogue even further. I don't know if Ambassador Murdoch, you want to move half of the WTO over to the CARICOM Pavilion when we're in COP for us to have, you know, further discussions on this. But Colleagues, thank you very much. Participants, thank you very much. This was
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Moderating. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Bye. Take care.
Good luck in Panama.
Thank you.